Several friends of mine who I think are very smart told me recently and independently that they don't think free will exists. I've never bought into this, and their arguments to me seemed thin and unconvincing. But these are really smart people who I respect, so I decided to give some consideration to the idea. There are different definitions for free will, which can be useful in different situations. However, it is important to choose a definition where it is meaningful to say we either have free will or we don't. Under some definitions of free will, it may be impossible for any being to have free will, even in theory. Under a definition like that, it is meaningless to say that we don't have free will because it would be too obvious. Not wrong, just meaningless. A common underlying defining characteristic of free will, which I happen to think is objective enough to be useful, is the contention that determinism is wrong, the antithetical or the refutation of determinism in the context of making decisions. We don't have a Laplace's demon or a time machine, unfortunately, but if we can conclude any aspect of behavior to be non-deterministic, then we would be able to conclude with the same degree of confidence that people have at least some degree of free will according to this definition. So when I say free will, I'm talking about the antithetical or the refutation of determinism in the context of making decisions. To elaborate a little on this definition, in theory a robot could have free will, but it would have to be truly probabilistic, not seemingly probabilistic due to pseudo-random algorithms. A quantum particle is probabilistic, but it does not make decisions, unless you employ an unusually loose definition of the word decision, so it does not have free will. The other essential definition that we must address is the self. To say you have free will, or you don't have free will. What do we mean exactly by the word you? This seems to me the most overlooked aspect of free will discussions. As a result, this is ultimately what I have chosen to focus on the most. After a great deal of consideration, I've concluded that a useful and objective definition of the self for the purposes of this discussion should at the very least include one's body. This would allow for it to be meaningful to either say we have free will or we don't have free will. Because to determine if a person has any other capability, we typically measure physical identifiers of that capability using their body. And to clarify, the brain is part of the body. This is true both for physical capabilities like digesting dairy or juggling, as well as abstract capabilities like empathy and love. There are well-documented neurological components of love like oxytocin, which are physical. Also, to express love requires action, the use of one's body, whether for buying flowers, doing thoughtful favors, exchanging affectionate words, or, well, you know. It is also important to recognize that many of the capabilities we say we have are unconscious, like digesting dairy or maintaining balance while walking. So, for example, it would be unreasonable to define oneself as only one's conscious thought in the context of free will. That would be meaningless not only because it would be obvious, but also because it would be unusual. I will further elaborate on this choice later on, but these are the main reasons why when I say you or me or refer to one's self, I am referring to the person's body. By the way, I would caution against regarding free will as purely abstract. Just because something is difficult to measure does not mean it is non-physical. Otherwise, abstract capabilities could turn into physical capabilities just because of improved technology over time. If we did have a Laplace demon, we could refute determinism with physical actions that are not predicted by the demon. So free will may not be so different from purely physical capabilities, like dunking a basketball or eating 30 hot dogs. So based on these definitions, I've always thought that it seems there is a certain random component to people's thoughts and actions, probably due to the probabilistic nature of subatomic particles. Therefore, the idea of determinism has always seemed silly to me, though I've never known nearly enough about this topic scientifically for this to be something I could say with any confidence. And in researching this, I also found that some people did not subscribe to the Copenhagen view that subatomic particles are intrinsically indeterministic. Though I'm sure they are valid, these views, like superdeterminism, are currently held by a scientific minority, and there is no conclusive evidence to indicate that they are better than the current majority view. And would a new, more precise underlying theory of quantum mechanics guarantee that it does not have some underlying component of its own which is probabilistic? So to avoid endless speculation, I'm basing my views on the current scientific majority understanding of quantum mechanics, which holds that quantum particles are probabilistic, not deterministic. So anyway, my first step in researching the free will debate was to focus on the role of quantum mechanics in the brain. And as it turns out, the answer to whether or not we have free will based on these definitions previously specified is actually pretty straightforward, but unfortunately has not yet been confirmed. There is an emerging field of science called quantum biology, or more specifically in this case, quantum neurobiology, which is beginning to explore quantum processes within the brain. As of the time this sentence was written, there seems to be at least one recent study to indicate that there are quantum effects that could play a role in human thought. In a solution with microtubule architectures, quantum links between particles were shown to enhance the emission of UV light. For context, microtubules are structures in the cytoplasm of cells which have an electrical charge and are so tiny they could potentially host quantum activity. And it is speculated that within neurons this could potentially play a role in one's thoughts. This phenomenon was found at relatively warm temperatures like a human brain, as opposed to current quantum computation experiments which require extremely cold temperatures. This is following several years of other types of biological processes in various plants and animals having been shown for the first time to use quantum effects. This is still a new and emerging field, but things seem to be moving in the direction of confirming quantum neurobiological processes. So as this field of science develops, we may very well find convincing evidence that there is a probabilistic component to thought, in which case determinism is as good as out the window. But we'll just have to wait and see. So anyway, let's move on to those who say that random thoughts that may occur in your mind due to unpredictable quantum behavior is not something you can control. And for that matter, neither are your tendencies based on genes and experiences. So even if determinism turns out to be wrong, there is still no free will. I will explain that people who say there is no free will, even accounting for the possibility of random subatomic processes influencing our thoughts, are generally running with a very particular definition of the self without properly scrutinizing that definition. And here is what I really think is the crux of my argument, because this is something that always seems to be overlooked in these discussions. Often the free will denier will skip providing an actual definition of one's self, but will refer to you as either an abstract, infinitesimal, or non-existent entity that only exists somewhere in your head and exclusively encompasses your conscious thought. Though definitions like this could be useful in some contexts, based on such definitions, you have little to no capabilities whatsoever. So to use a definition of the self like this to argue that we have no free will is useless because it's obvious, and crucially this is not the only accepted and useful definition of one's self, especially when we are talking about capabilities. If a person injures someone else, you might hear, "You hurt me," rather than "You hurt my arm." Does it not sometimes feel as though your hands and feet are part of you? When we talk about capabilities that we either have or don't have, usually we are referring to not just our minds, but our bodies and processes which are either conscious or unconscious. Am I capable of digesting dairy? No, because I don't have the proper enzymes in my stomach. Can I juggle? Yes, because my hands, eyes, and my cerebellum have been properly trained. But do I have free will? No, because actually I'm just a concept with no physical properties and can't really do anything at all. What? Why should we use a different definition of the self when talking about free will? A useful and objective definition of the self for the purpose of this discussion should at the very least include one's body. Again, the brain is part of the body. And by the way, we don't use our whole body for every task, so if any part of our bodies has a capability, then it is to be concluded that we have that capability, just like with anything else. And a capability can be either conscious or unconscious, just like with anything else. Because the brain, neurons, microtubules, and electrons within the brain are all part of one's body, based on this criteria, a connection between thought and quantum neurological probabilism would prove that we have some degree of free will. If the cytoplasm in my neurons is capable of reacting to electrical charges in a probabilistic way, and this influences my thoughts, you are never going to be able to predict my thoughts with certainty, even in theory. And if you can't predict my thoughts, you can't predict my choices either. I've heard it said that random subatomic behavior in your brain is contrary to free will because it is not something you can control. But again, hold on, what do we mean by you? Who is to say that those subatomic particles are not part of you? And why shouldn't they be considered part of you? Because of smallness? Because you are not conscious of those events? Almost every single capability we say we have is based to some extent on small and unconscious processes. Any subatomic particles reacting with the microtubules in your brain are not only in your head but playing an active role inside your neurons. To not consider those particles part of your body would require you to arbitrarily choose some disqualifying aspect, such as a specific level of smallness to regard as the cutoff point for being considered part of your body. And how would you do this objectively and in a way that is consistent with criteria for other capabilities? No, it would be much more straightforward, objective, and consistent for us to consider all matter within the body to be part of the body down to the smallest level. Similarly, I've also heard it said that you can't control what you want, or that you can't even control what you think, and therefore you have no free will. These statements are false simply because some part of you does control all these things all the time, just not necessarily consciously. Again, unconscious capabilities should be considered capabilities, unless we are willing to refer to some other context where it is actually useful to say that we have almost no capabilities whatsoever. So it is more meaningful, objective, and consistent to use one's body to define one's self in the context of a capability. Whether specific extremities like your hair or fingernails are part of your body would be a matter of irrelevant semantics in this case, because I'm not claiming that they refute determinism. Quantum neurobiological processes refute determinism. I think it could also be objective and meaningful in this case to define a person as their body combined with some abstract characteristics. But as long as the definition includes one's body, we can have an objective discussion about whether or not we have free will, and it is meaningful to say we either have it or we don't. And as long as the definition includes one's body, my argument is the same, and my answer is the same. In the end, after all this research and consideration, I've gone from being skeptical about free will deniers to being critical of free will deniers. Do we have free will? Probably. Why? Because quantum probabilism more and more seems to refute determinism. And those who disagree are probably using definitions which are less useful to this topic than those definitions I've chosen. Though I've focused on quantum randomness, I'm not saying that quantum randomness is dictating all of our actions, nor that it dictates any of our actions by itself for that matter. Rather, it is likely a component of our decision-making process, and it happens to be a component that causes our decision-making process to be impossible to predict with certainty, even in theory. Similarly, I'm also not saying that those random quantum movements in your brain are you, but that they are a component of you. Even if we acknowledge that a person is actually a construct, that doesn't mean that free will does not exist, or that it doesn't matter, nor that you don't exist, or that you don't matter. Almost everything in the universe is a construct, and many of these constructs undeniably have significant capabilities. Ultimately, pending further scientific research, our decision-making is likely a real and meaningful process that is made up of quantum probabilism, learned behavior, genetic tendencies, and maybe some other things. These factors influence each other and influence decision-making, and those decisions in turn influence our experiences. For our choices to be driven by such an intricately woven fabric is a characteristic that warrants exclusive descriptive terminology, distinguishing us from all the immense, relentless apathy throughout the universe. So in addition to all my more objective justifications, I contend that if this characteristic induces unpredictability, it is a thing not just fitting, but too rare and potent for us not to bestow the term free will.